Elias Morgan had always believed that the quiet moments before dawn revealed more truth than daylight ever could. Every morning, he woke before the alarms, brewed a single cup of black coffee, and stood by the kitchen window of his small suburban home, watching the sky lighten over the cul-de-sac. On this morning, though, the calm felt thin, as if the world were holding its breath. He couldn't explain why, but an unease ran beneath his skin, subtle yet insistent, like a forgotten memory trying to surface. Across the table, his 17-year-old daughter, Lila, scrolled through her phone with restless fingers, glancing up only when he cleared his throat. Her dark hair was tied in a loose knot, and her expression carried the weight of sleeplessness that had become too familiar. She had grown quieter over the past year, withdrawn, thoughtful, keeping her worries tucked behind a facade she assumed he couldn't see. Elias noticed every flicker of hesitation in her eyes, even when she didn't speak. "You're up early," he said, though she always was these days. "Couldn't sleep," Lila replied, pushing aside her untouched cereal. "Kept having that same dream again. The one with the lights?" She nodded. They weren't just lights this time. They felt closer. Elias didn't know what to make of that, but he reached for the comfort of routine. Dreams can feel real when we're stressed. "You've got finals coming up. College deadlines." "Dad, I'm not stressed about finals," she said, almost whispering. "It feels like something's coming. Something big." He wanted to reassure her, say the world was predictable, stable, safe, but the words stuck. For months the news had been filled with escalating conflicts, sharp statements from world leaders, footage of distant borders bristling with soldiers. Yet he had tried to keep their little household insulated from fear, believing that focusing on what he could control was the only reasonable path. The digital clock on the oven blinked 6:14. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled somewhere down the block. Everything looked normal enough, yet Lila's words lingered in the air like static. Elias breathed in the scent of coffee and felt it, an echo of her intuition humming inside him, stirring an old instinct he had tried to smother beneath practicality. It unnerved him how easily her quiet dread slipped beneath his defenses. He opened his mouth to reply, but a tremor rippled through the floor, so faint he almost dismissed it as imagination. The hanging glass ornament beside the window swayed with a soft, crystalline chime. Lila lifted her head. "Did you feel that?" "Probably construction," he said automatically, though there had been no construction for weeks. Another tremor followed, stronger this time. The mugs on the counter rattled, and a dull thud echoed in the distance, deep, metallic, unfamiliar. Elias's heartbeat quickened. He crossed to the window and pulled the curtains aside. The street lay still, touched by early light, nothing obviously amiss. But the air carried a subtle haze, shifting in strange currents he couldn't quite place. Lila stood beside him now, closer than she had been in days. "Dad, what's happening?" Before he could answer, a siren cut through the silence, a single, rising wail that froze them both. It wasn't the local emergency test tone they were used to. This sound was deeper, more urgent, vibrating through the walls and into their bones. A warning meant for everyone, everywhere at once. Elias felt his throat tighten. He stepped away from the window, searching for the right words, but Lila spoke first. "That's the National Alert System," she said, voice trembling. "I've heard recordings online. It only activates for—" She didn't finish. The siren grew louder, joined by another in the distance, and another after that, forming a network of desperate voices across the city. Elias grabbed his phone, hands shaking slightly, but the screen remained black despite several attempts to unlock it. No signal. No notifications. Only silence. "Dad," Lila whispered. "Is this it? The thing everyone's been afraid of?" He wanted to tell her no. He wanted to promise her safety. But promises felt fragile now. A flash of light burst across the horizon, brief, pale, unnatural. It wasn't bright enough to blind, but bright enough to terrify. A moment later, a shockwave rolled through the neighborhood, bending tree branches and sending a shudder through the ground. The house groaned as if under sudden weight. Lila pressed herself against him, and he wrapped an arm around her, instinct overpowering thought. "We need to get to the basement," Elias said, forcing calm into his voice.
Now.
They moved quickly, but not quickly enough to outrun the growing cacophony outside. Distant car alarms, frantic shouting, the thundering rush of wind that felt like the world exhaling in fear. Elias opened the basement door just as another rumble shook the house, the lights flickering overhead before plunging the hallway into dimness. Lila clutched his arm. "I'm scared." "I know," he said, pulling her close. "But we're together. We'll face whatever this is together." They descended the stairs, each step echoing with the weight of unspoken truths, his guilt for not preparing more, her fear of the dream she could no longer pretend was just imagination, the shared realization that the world outside had shifted in a single instant. When they reached the bottom, Elias closed the door behind them. The basement smelled of dust and old paint, illuminated only by the faint glow from a battery-powered lantern Lila switched on. Shadows clung to the corners like watching silhouettes. For a moment they stood in silence, listening to the muffled chaos above. Then, from somewhere beyond their walls, a low, resonant boom rolled through the earth, longer, heavier, unmistakably real. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a truth neither of them wanted to face. Unbearable. And as the last vibrations faded, a new sound rose, a slow, rhythmic pulsing tone unlike the siren before. A tone he had never heard in his life, yet one that carried a single, devastating message. Something had arrived. The pulsing tone vibrated through the basement walls like a heartbeat not their own, each throb a reminder that the world above had shifted into something unrecognizable. Elias stood motionless, feeling the rhythm settle into his ribs, as if the air itself were preparing them for a truth it refused to speak aloud. Lila held the lantern tighter, her face pale in its cold glow, the shadows around her trembling like frightened animals. The silence between them stretched, thick and uneasy, until she finally whispered, "What does that sound mean?" He wished he knew. He wished he could summon the calm authority she needed, but his thoughts were fogged by the memory of that flash on the horizon, too bright to be anything natural, too distant to pinpoint. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to ground them both. "It's a signal," he said. "Some kind of alert. We need to stay calm." Yet his voice betrayed him with a wavering edge, and Lila's eyes flickered with the realization that even her father was afraid. Another tremor nudged dust from the ceiling, the particles drifting through the lantern's beam like drifting ash. Lila sank to the floor, pulling her knees close, and Elias lowered himself beside her. In the dimness, their breaths synchronized, a fragile anchor in a world that had slipped its moorings. The basement felt too small, too enclosed, and yet stepping outside felt like stepping into the mouth of something enormous and unseen. Lila pressed her forehead to her knees. "I keep thinking about the dream," she murmured. "Maybe it was trying to warn me." Elias hesitated. Dreams reflect fear, not prophecy. But what if it was more? She looked up at him, her voice trembling with conviction. The lights falling from the sky, the shaking, the sound. "It feels like I've been seeing this for weeks." He wanted to dismiss it, but the way she spoke, soft, steady, sure, left him unsettled. Lila had always been intuitive, but this bordered on something deeper. Something he didn't know how to face. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Whatever comes, we handle it together. That's what matters." Above them, a faint metallic crash echoed through the street, followed by the sudden, frantic barking of a dog. Elias stiffened. The pulse tone faltered, then resumed with greater intensity, as if reacting. Lila rose to her feet, lantern lifted. "We can't just sit here," she said, her voice gaining an edge of resolve. "We need to know what's happening." Elias hesitated, torn between instinct and fear. But the uncertainty, the waiting, it gnawed at him. He nodded reluctantly. "Just the stairs. We don't open the door unless we have to." They climbed the steps quietly, each footstep deliberate. Elias cracked the basement door just enough to see the hallway. The power remained out, and the house was washed in blue-gray morning light seeping through gaps in the curtains. It felt eerie, suspended, as though it belonged to a memory rather than a living moment. Lila stepped beside him, and together they listened. No siren now. No explosions. Only distant, muffled cries and the low hum of something electrical drifting across the neighborhood. Elias moved toward the front window, pulling the curtain aside by a mere inch. The street was nearly empty. Cars sat abandoned at odd angles, doors open, as if their owners had fled. A utility pole leaned at an unsettling angle, and smoke curled from somewhere several blocks away. But what struck him most was the sky. Thin streaks of silver lit up the upper atmosphere, like scratches across the blue, shimmering and fading in unpredictable patterns. Lila followed his gaze. "Dad, those are the lights from my dream." He swallowed hard. Maybe it's debris. Satellite fragments. Something from the upper orbit. But why all at once? He had no answer. A sudden movement caught his eye. A figure stumbled out from behind a parked car. A neighbor he recognized, Mr. Rourke, wearing slippers and a torn bathrobe. He clutched a radio to his chest, shouting words Elias couldn't hear. His gestures were frantic, wild. Before Elias could react, a second figure ran into view, yelling as well, pointing upward. The two collided in a panic and fell to the pavement. Elias shut the curtain quickly, his heartbeat pounding loud enough for Lila to hear. "We're not going out there," he said, voice strained. Lila didn't argue. She backed away, her breaths coming quicker. Everything's falling apart.
But why?
What started this? Elias opened his mouth but froze when a new noise pierced the air, one sharper than the others. A descending whistle that sent instinct crawling across his skin. Lila grabbed his arm. "Get down." A dull explosion thudded somewhere distant, the shockwave rolling through the walls like a rushing tide. Objects tumbled from shelves. Picture frames shattered. The house groaned again, this time with a shudder that felt dangerously close. Elias shielded Lila with his body, holding her until the tremor dissolved. When they rose, dust hung thick in the air. Lila wiped her face, voice hoarse. "Dad, this isn't just an attack, is it? This feels bigger." He met her gaze, seeing his own fear mirrored back at him, but also something else. Determination. Strength. A resilience she had hidden beneath all her quiet worries. "Whatever it is," he said, "we're still alive. We have to stay that way." As they retreated toward the basement, a crackling sound interrupted them, thin, distorted, yet unmistakably artificial. Lila clutched the lantern toward the radio on the workbench. Its dial glowed faintly, flickering with intermittent bursts of static. Elias approached slowly, hands steady despite the tremble in his chest. The static warped into fragments of a voice. "Unidentified impact zones global remain indoors," repeating. The transmission faltered, then surged again, sharper this time. "Not natural sky breach event, all sectors." The radio cut to static. Elias and Lila stared at each other, the words settling like ice in their veins. Breach event. Not natural. Something the world had not prepared for. Something that had arrived without warning, rewriting their understanding of everything in a single breath. Lila whispered, "Dad, what does that mean?" He wished he didn't know. He wished he could lie. But the sky outside, the pulse tone, the tremors, none of it felt human. And as another distant flash lit the horizon in a ghostly arc, Elias realized nothing would ever be the same. "It means," he said quietly, "that this isn't just war anymore." Elena woke before the alarm, roused by the faint metallic clatter drifting through the thin apartment walls, a sound she had always assumed belonged to someone else's restless life. But today it threaded itself into her thoughts with uncanny insistence, as though urging her to rise before the day could decide its own direction. She sat up slowly, aware of the hollow ache behind her ribs, and listened. A second clatter echoed, softer this time, followed by a shuffling that reminded her of boots dragging across pavement. It was distant but deliberate, a rhythm that nudged her into motion. She pushed aside the curtain, hoping for the tender mauve glow that usually settled over the street at dawn, but the sky was strangely colorless. A diffuse gray smothered the horizon, dimming the familiar outlines of the bakery awning and the rusted mailbox where Adrian used to wait for her after work. The air looked thick, almost bruised, carrying the vague distortion that precedes a storm or something far more unnatural. Elena pressed her palm against the cold glass and searched the empty street for any sign of Adrian's return, though she already sensed the day would not give her that mercy. When she stepped into the hallway, she found Mara kneeling by the door, tying her laces with an aggression that betrayed her trembling hands. Mara's backpack was stuffed beyond capacity, the zipper straining, and a rolled map poked out at an awkward angle. She looked up at Elena with a mixture of defiance and fear, her pupils dilated, her throat working as she struggled to swallow whatever words had been collecting during the night. Elena recognized the expression. It was the same one she'd worn the day she first arrived in the city, desperate to believe she belonged somewhere. "You heard it too," Mara said, tightening the strap over her shoulder without waiting for confirmation. "Those trucks aren't passing through anymore. They stopped at the barricade. Something's happening, Elena. Something they didn't warn us about." Her voice cracked on the last syllable, revealing the truth beneath the urgency. She was terrified not of the unknown, but of being unprepared for it. Elena opened her mouth to ask what she meant, yet the words tangled into silence as another metallic thud reverberated through the building, rattling the loose ceiling fixture above them. Elena knelt beside her, steadying Mara's hand with her own. The younger woman's pulse raced under her fingertips, fast and fluttering. "We don't know that it's bad," Elena said, though doubt crept into her tone. "People move supplies all the time. Barricades go up every month." She tried to assemble a soothing explanation, but each possibility collapsed under the weight of Mara's unblinking stare. Mara wasn't one to panic without reason, and Elena, for all her forced optimism, could feel the tension tightening around them like a wire pulled to the brink. As they walked downstairs, the stairwell smelled faintly of dust and stale coffee, as if the building itself had been holding its breath. On the landing, Mr. Klein leaned against the railing, his radio pressed to his ear. Static hissed through the device, interspersed with clipped syllables that dissolved before they could form meaning. He didn't acknowledge them until Mara called his name, and even then, he lifted only his eyes. They gleamed with the dull sheen of someone who had heard too much, yet understood too little. "Transmission cut out half an hour ago," he said, tapping the radio as though frustration could coax clarity from it. "They mentioned a closure, then nothing. Don't like the feel of it." Outside, the air held a metallic tang that settled on Elena's tongue like dust. The street was lined with abandoned crates, as though a supply truck had spilled its cargo in haste. Wind teased loose papers into spiraling eddies, but it was the unnatural stillness of the people, those who had stepped out of their buildings only to freeze in wary observation, that made her stomach twist. Conversations floated past as faint murmurs, fragments slipping free. No broadcasts, roads sealed. Military movement north. None offered comfort. Mara tugged Elena's sleeve and pointed toward the intersection. A cluster of soldiers stood beside an armored vehicle, their posture rigid, their helmets lowered to obscure their expressions. One raised a megaphone, but instead of instructions, only static emerged, choked and broken. The soldier slammed the device against his palm, muttered something to his partner, and signaled for the others to form a wider perimeter. Elena watched their movements, disciplined, tense, efficient, and realized with a sinking chill that they weren't organizing civilians. They were preparing for something approaching. She felt her throat tighten. If Adrian were here, he would have steadied her with a wry smile and an offhand comment about overreacting. He always anchored her when uncertainty threatened to pull her apart. But he wasn't here, and the ache she'd woken with now bloomed into something heavier. Mara noticed the shift and slipped her hand into Elena's, a quiet gesture that asked for nothing, yet offered everything. "We'll find him," Mara said softly, though Elena hadn't spoken his name. The sky darkened as a low rumble vibrated through the pavement, deeper and more resonant than thunder. A hush rolled across the crowd as everyone tilted their heads in unison. The sound grew, layered and discordant, like several engines struggling against each other. Elena stepped closer to Mara, shielding her instinctively. The soldiers braced themselves, gripping their weapons though they aimed at nothing. A strange glow pulsed along the horizon, faint, rhythmic, and unsettlingly deliberate. A woman behind them gasped as the glow intensified, casting sharp, elongated shadows. Elena squinted, trying to discern its source, but the light shifted erratically, flickering like a malfunctioning beacon. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Something was wrong in a way that transcended the mundane mishaps the city had learned to endure. The soldiers exchanged frantic gestures, radios crackling uselessly. One soldier removed his helmet, as if needing to verify the reality before him with unobstructed eyes. Without warning, the glow vanished, snuffed out as though swallowed. The sudden darkness felt suffocating. For several heartbeats, no one spoke or moved. Then a single, piercing alarm erupted from the direction of the barricade, followed by a burst of frantic shouting. Elena felt the ground tremble again, this time closer. The armored vehicle roared to life, tires screeching, and the soldiers surged toward the barricade, abandoning their perimeter. Mara clutched Elena's arm, her voice barely audible above the chaos. "That wasn't natural," she whispered. "Tell me you felt it." Elena didn't answer. She couldn't, because as the alarm blared and the street dissolved into motion, she finally recognized the rhythm of the earlier metallic clatter, the one that had dragged her from sleep. It wasn't random noise or distant construction. It was the same dissonant cadence Adrian had described in his last message before he vanished. The sound he said marked the beginning of something he wasn't allowed to explain. And now it was here,